Super. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. We're testing out an idea of where we can just try and get some conversations going around what you all are up against as you're moving into this space and where MSPs fit in, where C3PAOs fit in, and really trying to help you all establish some scope about what you're up against and so forth. So, just generally, we're looking to do this conversationally and just we call it a fireside chat, but more or less just to make it an open dialogue to help get you guys the information you need. There's a lot at stake here, as you know, as the primes are putting more pressure on to get people certified, to get their suppliers certified, and so forth. And there's a lot of pressure on the C3PAOs and even the MSPs in the space to be able to match the moment. So for today, we have a couple of people that are deep into this on the open approach side, which is the MSP side. We're a CMMC level 2 certified RPO and a number of other compliance related um, elements to our work. We have Brandon Sitch Brown, who was instrumental in driving our certification, is now driving certification work in our client set. And so thanks, Brandon, for being here. And then with us, we also have Brent Lauk, who is with Eide Bailey, who was our C3PO when we went through our certification process and is now working with some of our mutual clients. Um, and so thank you for joining us all the way from Florida today. Um, what we're going to do, we've got a couple we divided this up into three sections. We've got some questions pre-built. Emily, who is sort of DJing this event, has produced some great notes, which I'll refer to try and keep us on track. But along the way, if you have any questions, by all means, just fire them off. Emily's going to be tracking those, and we'll try and leave ample time to get through some of those. So without further ado, or should we get rolling here?
Yeah,
All right, great.
absolutely.
So um, I think what we're really going to start with first is setting the landscape of what this looks like from a business perspective. I think we've seen it. You're probably feeling it that oftentimes business leaders want to go towards IT to get this resolved, and there is no doubt that IT is an enormous part of this. But in the end, CMMC is more about revenue and contract eligibility and procurement and some business maturity than it is IT. IT has a big part play in this. IT can drive a fair amount of this, but there's more to it. I think, guys, if you're okay with it, let's start there and maybe set the stage for what it looks like from a business perspective. Let me get to some of Emily's questions here that are good prompts. So let's start with that. There is a common perception that this gets handed off to the I team, but why is that a framing problem? And what does it actually, uh, what's the damage to organizations that see it as an IT centric thing versus a sort of more holistic approach? And I guess, Brandon, I'll send this to you first.
Yeah, I think a lot of the issues that we've seen is exactly that. Everyone's like, oh, this is an IT issue. When it's, yes, it is a majority of an IT issue, but a lot of the issues actually stem from, background checks, leadership buy-in, and a lot of those things, which I think people don't necessarily look at a whole lot. So that's a huge issue that we're seeing. And I think at the end of the day, too, the primes are pushing this down, or if you are a prime in this webinar, then it's something like you can't end up bidding on these contracts if you don't actually go for it. So it's no longer an IT issue. It's really a fundamental business issue. So if you don't treat it as a board level decision, then you're not really going to have, the buy-in from all of your staff as well. And that's, I think, one of the biggest aspects is if you don't have the leadership buy-in, then no one's really going to listen to just IT. And I think that's the issue we've seen a lot of. Brent, I don't know if you've also seen sort of similar aspects there.
Yeah, no, from the assessor standpoint, a lot of the assessments that have great success, it's all in, all hands on deck, right? So management down to the frontline staff have some awareness of CMMC and protecting CUI and FCI data, and really just kind of it's a culture of cybersecurity awareness around CMMC. It's not, the ones that have had failures or have not gone as smoothly or have been what's called a hard stop. We just don't get into the assessment. It's usually the IT manager that's been tasked with getting CMMC done, and they don't have the support of upper management to pull in other people within the business, right? So I think it definitely is an all hands on deck
Yeah,
process.
I think, from my perspective as both a business owner and working with other business owners that are going through this, like you cannot escape the fact that this is going to be expensive. It's going to be time consuming of your internal resources. And if the organization itself is not ahead of it, it's going to fight it. And if they fight it, it gets more expensive and you're more likely to fail. You really need to have deep cultural buy-in and a mission to get this done, and then assemble your team, which is going to be multiple people involved internally, externally. Brent, I'm curious, we're on the MSP side, so we're only working with clients that have realized that they need to work with an MSP. But have you seen some internal teams try to drive this and with
Yeah.
success?
Only probably one to date's done it successfully, and they had lots of extensive experience. But for a small and medium business, no, it is pretty hard to navigate. So that's why we strongly suggest or are working with a qualified MSP. I think a lot of C3POs and RPOs would kind of agree that that kind of gets you to where you need to be.
Yeah,
There's just a lot of unknowns in this space, even if you've worked in the defense or federal space for quite some time. There's just specifics with CMMC and the 32 CFR program that are just unique nuances to other frameworks or assessments.
yeah,
And Scott, one other thing that I wanted to add too is we've actually been running into it quite a lot lately is, similar to us when we did our setup is, you want to potentially bid on contracts in the future, but you don't have any contracts currently. So people don't necessarily see the ROI at the end of the day. So they're like, oh, this is going to cost me, $300,000 to build out. But if they don't see that ROI, it's really hard for them to justify. So, and that also
yeah,
goes to a lot of people here. Like if you guys have, $500,000 contracts, I mean, I would really evaluate, hey, is this enough to actually continue down this route? Because unless you're getting pretty big contracts, you are spending a lot of upfront money to actually foot your foot into the CMMC side of things. So you got to
yeah.
calculate if you can do additional bids down the line or if you need to actually move out of the space because it's almost going to cost you more than the actual bids that you'll be getting.
Right. To
Yep.
make matters worse, but also more interesting, is that that decision needs to be made by a lot of these suppliers, and a lot of suppliers are going to back out, which means opportunity for those that go into it. But that's unknown, right? There's opportunity for those that go early. There's opportunity for those that expand what they're able to manufacture or produce for the primes underneath their CMMC umbrella. And that's a big calculation as to where this goes. One other thing I just want to quickly note, if is that as you're thinking about this, some of these costs, it's from my perspective and everything I've read, the DoD is expecting these costs to get baked into contracts. And so some of these costs you can fold in if you lean into this into your future contracts. I think they know full well that if you're doing a couple $1 million worth of business with them and you have to drop a quarter of a million, hopefully not that much, but let's just say into your certification, that's going to show up in the pricing. But it does give you an opportunity to go after contracts that maybe you couldn't get before. Um, let's move on to a next question here because that's a good framing. And I think this kind of goes into what we're seeing on the MSP side. Brent, what you're seeing on the C3PAO side is where do MSPs, because our company and lots of other MSPs to varying degrees are managing these environments that are going to have to undergo significant security updates, process updates, even some application replacements. I mean, it's hefty, and it involves a lot of maturity on the part of the MSP and able to match that moment. What have you seen, Brent?
Yeah, this is kind of timely. I think a lot of times it's either overcomplicating or not doing enough. So
Yeah,
it's basically first starting with your business. What is your business, right? Are you a manufacturer? Are you a construction company? Do you just maybe the only CUI or CUI that you get is it just in an email format? Or are you getting schematics, right? So it's really starting with the business context, and that will kind of frame up the technical stack or technology you need to implement, right? So I think that's kind of the bigger piece, and a lot of times I see folks that overcomplicate it, or like I just told you earlier today, I met someone that they had an MSP that told them that they have to be in a GCC high Azure environment. That's the only way they can get certified, which
Right.
is not the case. You can be completely on
Yeah.
premise and have a you guys know firsthand you can get certified with on premise environment. So
Right.
I think that's the main thing is not really where they stand is they don't necessarily know where their the data is, and then also what requirements or technical um, implementations they need to make. If that makes
Yeah.
sense. So
And on like from the MSP perspective, um, Brandon, like you, our basic approach is to have a stack, a significant stack that we've certified, we know it works, and when we implement that, we sort of can clear off a number of controls for our clients, but like there still is room for nuance, even working with a company like ours.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the approach we're taking is, we went through our assessment and I was in everyone's shoes that's on the call here of, what does it look like? What are the auditors expecting? Is Brent going to be a really mean guy? What's he going to dive into? And there was just so many unknowns. And I think, we're bringing that expertise to, any of these MS or people that we're engaging with our MSP services. So we're actually bringing that knowledge and more or less helping run your assessment. So, because we know what the auditors are looking for, what questions they're going to ask, what they want to hear. Whereas, I think my first assessment, I'm like, oh God, I'm panicking. I don't know what to do. And, preventing others from being in those shoes and actually having someone to help guide you through the process. Um, but I think going back to what Scott was saying, a really important part of what we wanted to do is build out an actual certified enclave. So we could say we've been through the process ourselves and we know what it is. And I think that's a lot of MSPs out there are saying they understand CMMC, but unless you've been through the process yourself, I don't think you can thoroughly say you understand it as much as, the client when they're actually going through it. So I think by us vetting, our tools and our processes and procedures, I think we're just further amplifying that we're doing the proper thing when it comes to CMMC so we can relay that knowledge and expertise to the client going through the CMMC process.
Can you speak, either of you, a little bit to what it's now, I think they've changed it from cloud service provider. It's a slightly different measure, but fundamentally, what the difference between like engaging an MSP, because there are, you can, and I'm not saying this from us, of course, we're deeper into this than many MSPs, but there is a successful way to work with your MSP. Um, if they provide a shared responsibility matrix, become a CSP and so forth. But I think it's worth, because this is going to be an early question for anybody going into this that's working with an MSP currently is, what's involved in bringing your MSP along? If they're not already certified like we are, if the stack isn't built out like kind of what we're trying to do, but it's a more standard stack, what does it look like to go through the journey with them?
so we've been involved in this since 2019. So right when things were starting to be, it's almost 7 years now. And a lot of times when folks try to bring their MSP along, they typically aren't able to keep up or they have to implement it. So it's a lot of work if they're not willing to put in the time and because they'll have to make their own investments and like you guys know firsthand, right? You'll have to make your own, set aside time and resources to get in that space. So it is a
Hmm.
journey to get there. Sometimes it takes 9 months to a year is kind of the saying that people have. I think that's pretty true. Could be 6 to 9 months, but it does take some time to get them up to speed if they're not familiar with this space.
Gotcha. Yeah. Uh, I have to say that when we were going through this, it took me a while as a business owner. I'm probably getting slow in my years, but to sort of understand the difference between what we're doing and a cloud service provider, which an MSP can fall under. I would just, from my perspective, as you all are thinking about starting this, um, vet that quickly. Like go into it quickly and figure out where your MSP is, how committed they are to working with you on this, and so forth, because it becomes a pivotal moment in this process. I'm going to throw it out there. I think somewhere a little over half of the total controls are IT controls. They still need management buy-in, they still need cultural buy-in, but they are IT related controls. So the more that you can have that contained and tidy, and you're not actually having to push your MSP through that, they are engaged in doing it themselves, the better.
Yep.
Um, and so forth. So, any other thoughts on that particular
I'll
aspect
add
of this?
I'll add a little bit in there, and I think something we've seen a lot of, and something we were actually really blindsided in regards to is the shared responsibility matrix, especially when it comes to security protection assets. Actually having your SRMs for all of your security protection assets. Brent, as you know, we went through a huge process of that in the beginning, and I think there was a lot of ambiguity around it, which luckily, between all the C3POs and the Cyber AB, they finally clarified that. I think a lot of MSPs out there aren't prepared for having all of their tool sets having those shared responsibility matrices.
Yep.
We actually had to switch a lot of our vendors, or quite a few of our vendors, because they weren't willing to provide what we needed for CMMC. And I think that's a huge gap that, a lot of these MSPs are going into the assessments. Then, someone like Brent's like, hey, okay, where's the shared responsibility matrix for your vendors? And they're just blindsided by it. Because we
Yeah.
were initially too. It's Unfortunately, it's not something small because it's a very thorough document that's essentially the shared responsibilities between what you're doing as the client or MSP and what they're actually providing. So that's one that I think is going to blindside a lot of the MSPs out there.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. We do have a
Um,
question. Saw that.
Yeah, it looks like we got a couple questions. If you don't mind me jumping in,
Yeah.
and
yeah.
asking a few. So, we actually have one from Anita. Thank you, Anita. So Anita's in Reston, Virginia, and she wants to know, how do you typically handle the CUI boundary definition in complex environments, especially when clients have cloud, on-prem, and contractor-owned devices mixed together?
Brandon, do you want to start? I can take it
Oh, you
after.
you you can start with that one. I know you love boundaries.
So I think from the assessor standpoint, and prior to assessment work, like I was saying, we were an RPO and consulted. So it really starts with the flow. But we look at the perimeter boundary firstly. So to like answer that question, I'd really start with the network firewall or the actual perimeter itself, and then from there we'd kind of work our way in. So if you do have on-premise cloud, there may be some segmentation, but it ultimately starts with that. And then if there's, like I have one in a few weeks that has four, I think 9 locations. So then we kind of have to factor that in too. So all those boundaries, but depending on the size and complexity, it could get a little well documented, I'll say, or pretty over documented, but it can expand. But the first thing is really that high level network infrastructure boundary, and then kind of working yourself in, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
that's high level, but it always starts with the data flow, CUI flow, and where does that transverse through the network firstly, and then from there the devices and systems and people. Go ahead,
Yeah, and
Brandon.
I was really going to emphasize the data flow diagram aspect. What we've seen a lot of is people, funny enough, don't know what CY is, which if you're working in the DoD space, you really should. But really defining, what's storing, processing, and transmitting CY. We've seen, we'll be working on an SSP for a year, then, a couple weeks before the assessment, someone's like mentioned something. Oh, we received CY through here too. And you're like, we thought we thoroughly vetted this with everyone. How are we still finding areas that CY is coming in from? And I think, that's the biggest aspect. Do you have it coming in through email? Are you using vendor portals, DoD portals? So I really think it comes down to that. And once you have that, data flow diagram, you can really start building out your overall boundary of where that CY is also flowing.
I'm going to throw a little bit in on that too, which is my impression is that a lot of companies, and Brent, this would be something I'd be curious what you've seen, but the data flow diagram, where CUI's going, how they're handling it, and so forth, generally is a big surprise to a lot of companies. It tends to be a little more expansive. It touches more aspects of their company than they ever imagined.
Mhm.
And what they're initially imagining as their scope quickly can balloon in order to meet the standard.
Yep.
Is
Yeah,
that seen? Yeah.
that's accurate. I mean, there's everything down to ERP systems. If you have any other like in construction, there's a lot of like schematics that go put in there, and that's right away that's CUI. So there's just certain things you just don't think of until you really, to
Right.
Brandon's point, talk about the data flow, and you're like, oh shoot, yep, we have CUI here, we have it there. So, um, and I think there's another question too about your approach on kind of a broader enterprise-wide network versus an enclave, and really segmenting it out. And I think that's a good thing to talk through is um, there are cases where the whole environment's just simply because of how things operate, it has to be in scope. But I think one thing I always suggest, I don't know if Brandon would agree. But if the business is able to put it in an enclave and segment it out, that is probably the best solution just from a risk perspective and overall, I'd say ease of use or makes things a little bit more smoother, but that's not always the case depending on the business, right? So I don't
Right.
know if it answered that question, if you guys see that question, but
Yeah.
that is something to consider.
Yeah, and I would say it's especially hard in the
Sorry,
manufacturing realm. Oh,
Brandon,
go
not
ahead,
to cut
Emily.
you. I just want everyone to be able to know the question. So the question came in from Paige, and she's asking, what's your approach when a client insists their entire network is in scope versus when you recommend enclave segmentation?
Yeah, so sort of going off of that, I think it really goes back to the data flow diagram and making sure you know where the CUI is living. Because if you can build an enclave, it's 100% the way to go because it's so much easier, whether it's a physical enclave or a virtual enclave. We actually had one of our clients where this was a big decision we had to make of like, do we include everything in scope or do we build out an enclave? And they wanted to expand pretty rapidly into other divisions and other aspects. So we actually ended up going with, the full division in scope versus an enclave. And I really think it comes down to a lot of where does your CUI currently flow and where does it flow in the future? It might be easier to actually build that out in your SSP and data flow diagram now instead of trying to tack it on later, which could potentially mean you need a reassessment down the line.
I think that's a key point is that this process, for better or for worse, is a bit painful. And if you cut it down too much to make it simple in the beginning, you have to realize that that has multi-year and expensive implications. They may work great and it could be the way to go, but you really need to be honest with yourselves about where you want to go with this. Are you going to expand into new lines? If you are bringing on new software packages or new manufacturing types, these things could all change the scope enough that they trigger another audit. And so it's really worth thinking this through. And don't think you're running necessarily. It's pure safety to run towards an enclave. Look at your whole organization and how you're going to be handling this, and make a long-term decision because all of this is expensive, and you want to make sure that you can leverage it versus be restricted by it. I want to flip real quick because I think this is a good question for this first section on the business reality that we're trying to cover. Real quick, the question is, how much weight does documentation actually carry in an assessment? And and the burden of that, I suppose I would like to go one step further on, like the burden of both gathering the documentation, noting it, and being able to present it in a coherent, manageable way to the audit team. Can we talk about that briefly? I don't want to get too hung up on it because we got other things to go to, but just briefly, can we touch on that?
Yeah. Brandon, do you want to start? I mean, I can tell
Yeah.
the assessor point. Go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think documentation is always something I think that's very important, no matter if you're going for compliance certifications or not. But it does make, from my experience, it makes it a lot easier if you can just show the auditor your policies and procedures, your documentation, whether that's technical or not. It makes your life a lot easier. I would say the biggest caveat to that, though, is don't just write a policy, make sure you're actually following that policy, which gets into one of the big things that I, wanted to mention throughout this is your SSP is, a living document and more or less the bread and butter of when it comes to CMMC. So making sure everything you're doing in there, you're actually doing. Because then Brent comes along and says, okay, you say you have FIPS encryption enabled on all your workstations. Is that actually the case? And he checks and there's no evidence for it. So documentation, I think, is key for this assessment, but also making sure you're following your documentation and policies. Like when you say you're doing a new user onboarding and you follow that documentation, make sure that's actually practice, not something you just do for the auditors.
Brent, you
Yeah.
mentioned, I remember a while back you'd said like coming into these audits, you can pretty quickly tell if it's going to be a successful audit
Yep.
around how the documentation looks.
Yeah, I think that's huge. A big part of the preparatory work for the assessment is artifact gathering. So, from an assessor's standpoint, if we're working through a control, let's use 311 alpha, which is just user access. We're going to start with we're going to start the system security plan, but we're going to flow down from that SSP all the way down to any in-scope system. So effectively anything that you kind of mentioned as a CUI asset, we're gonna hope to see a screenshot or user listing for. And to Brandon's point, if you're putting it and documenting it, this may sound bad, but you need to be prepared to show us that that's implemented. And that's kind of the expectation going into it is we'll ask during the assessment week, hey, this is great. I see your SSP, tells me you're doing this on you have FIPS validated cryptography on your firewall. can you show me the encryption algorithms and the validation certificate, or however you want to play that in real time. So
Yeah.
you
This
got to
this
kind of
is
support it.
This is a big contrast from some of you who might have done CMMC 1.0 self-attestation type documentation. Like this is an audit. This will, when you get to this level, they're going to look and they're going to verify your documentation and your activity. And then that will get followed up on over the next 3 years. So thank you for that. I thought it was worth just spending a couple minutes. Let's flip. Let's flip over to the process itself. And we're running a little short on time based on what we're hoping to cover here, but just keep that in mind as we're answering some of these questions. I'm going to flip this one to you, Brent.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about what a C3PAO does and their role in all of this.
Yeah. So C3PO is a third party assessing organization, right? So we're certified by the Cyber AB, and we ourselves at one point in time went through a DIPCAC assessment. So we had to spin up our own environment that had to get certified. And part of a C3PO is a team, or in this case, for Ed Bailey, we have we have about 5 leads and quite a few CCAs underneath we're just certified assessors. So we provide that independent review of an organization's CMMC posture against NIST 800-171 revision 2 at this point. So that's kind of a high level. Our firm itself, we're a 100-year-old CPA firm that's been in the IT audit space for quite some time. So doing these third-party reviews like SOC 2s, FedRAMP, HITRUST, that's not new to us, right? So
Right.
that's high level to our team.
Yeah. Um, let's flip a little bit to like what you all are like broadly when if I think most of the people on this call are going to be thinking about uh geez, do I do this? And if I'm going to do it, what does it look like? So can we talk a little bit about like um from an assessor standpoint, if you're looking at all the elements that a client has to move through in order to come up to the point of audit, what are the primary elements there?
That's a good question. I think there's a few phases. I think there was a slide actually at the beginning that kind of called it out too, but a
Uh,
lot of it's kind of readiness. So I think that's the first phase, right? You move to that, you validate your controls, very much like a self-assessment, and then you'll probably want to meet with a few C3POs, kind of working through this process, um, validate their pricing, their timing, kind of get it. My biggest thing is to get a sense of how they operate and if they're good to work with, and then usually their timeline. So you want to probably have a good 6 to 8 weeks of preparatory lead time to gather, final documentation, meet a few times, confirm scope, and then once you move into it, kind of like our SSP conversation, there's kind of three elements we always say. First one's a up-to-date SSP that outlines all the ways you're implementing the 320 control objectives. So that's the biggest thing right away is your SSP really needs to stand on its own on how you're implementing the controls. And then part of that is also scoping. So knowing the scoping of assets. So 32 CFR, which is a CMC program, outlines the 4 categories of asset types, and really knowing how those are and the implications there is huge. And then fourth is the artifacts. So for all those 320 objectives, there needs to be some documentation or some screenshots or configurations that we can use to validate. So those have to be time date stamped, something to show, hey, April 30th, 2026, here's our GPO of passwords in our environment to align with our password complexity requirements, for example, right? So that's kind of the gravity of it.
yeah.
Depending on the workload, it could be there's some packages I get that have 2,000 artifacts. There's some that have 300. It just depends on how you structure it, but it takes a bit of time to put the package together for the assessment.
Can I flip this to you, Brandon? Because I like uh there's a lot to track in this. There's a lot, like we as an MSP, we with our security stack, we have to provide a lot of this artifact documentation. But how are we? Can you speak just a little bit about like how we're managing this? Because it's going to be similar for anybody, hopefully, going through this. How do we manage this with clients when they're looking at 320 controls and artifacts, thousands of pieces of artifacts in some cases that need to be in there? like what's the best? What are we doing? I guess because we think it's the best, of course, for getting
Yes.
clients through this.
So to start, we did it more the archaic way of just Word and Excel. The first time Brent actually sent over the evidence request sheet, I nearly cried that night because it was so many objectives you needed evidence for. And so we more or less just had a folder structure and, put our evidence in there according to the specific controls and objectives. It worked for us. We got through our certification, but I think we quickly realized that's not really scalable when it comes to doing it at, a higher scale. So
And for multiple
yeah,
clients, right?
we've actually recently switched in, after talking with other C3POs and stuff, of using a GRC tool to really help, templatize it to a certain extent and have a lot of this, pre-filled out for, companies that go with us. Because like Scott said, there is so many of those, controls and objectives that actually do fall under us and won't really change no matter what client or infrastructure we go into, because it's, the same EDR or the same SIM solution. So yeah, we've really started using a GRC platform where we can interact with the client and also give the assessors access to that GRC platform to easily see the evidence, export the SSP. It just makes the whole process a lot more streamlined instead of having just a folder structure that no one really knows how to navigate, then figuring out how to share that. So it makes life a lot easier. And I think a lot of people are really moving towards GRC tools, and I think the market is growing substantially.
I will
Yeah.
say that as a business owner, when I hear templates, I hear yay because it makes it sound to me like some of that work is done ahead of time and I can just sort of adopt it and it's going to save me time and money. But to be clear, you have to be careful with these templates. Like they can drive a lot of activity. They can actually move you forward really quickly, but you cannot just assume that because it's written there that it's now applicable and that it's going to pass an audit. It still has to go through rigor. So I think if I had to summarize it, it's the combination of templates, powerful tools, and a fidelity to keeping everything up to date and in that tool in an organized way. All those controls, all that work really needs to be tied together well, and it does need to be individualized for your organization. You can't just slap templates on top of this. As attractive as that sounds, it doesn't really work. And that kind of makes I'm going to skip a couple questions here. Here's one I thought might be interesting to cover as we move along. What trips organizations up? And I came to that from the template. If you adopt the template too generically, it's going to be found out in the auditing process. Are there other things that they should look out for when they get into this journey?
Yeah, I think a big thing is just overall awareness of the regulation. So that's 32 CFR, which is the CMC program, and all the nuances that are part of that. So that regulation set the assessment procedures, assessment guide. It set the standard for everything that we do. So when we follow the CAP or the CMC assessment process, that's all based off of that regulation, right? So I think
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of times where organizations aren't necessarily coupled up with an MSP, that I'll ask, hey, have you identified your CUI assets? And they don't know what a CUI asset is. And then that,
Uh,
at some points they've already paid us, they're under a contract to some degree. They have an SSP, but we don't necessarily get into those nitty-gritty details sometimes when you look at the whole enterprise. So, they just basically have to find an MSP or find a way to get that. So I think that's big, is just knowing the regulation. So I think that's the first step I always say is maybe send a staff member through like the RPO or course or the CMC RP course just to get a concrete foundational understanding of CMMC. I do have some that go through the CCP process, but I think that does help some folks. So
what about internal or like at least with your MSP or some provider that's really aware of the CAP process of what needs to take place? Um, I would assume that helps it, but where do you see that coming into the like who
what
plays that
trips them
role?
up, or
What's that?
what was it? Sorry, like the what trips them up, or who would be
Yeah,
responsible
just
for
the
that?
awareness of everything that's going to take place, how it really is going to be seen, what assessors and auditors are going to look at, and in these controls, and understanding how this fits together. Like, probably nice to have that on staff. That's a fairly high level, advanced level of training, but where do you see that coming in?
Usually it's the IT people. That's the biggest thing, or the MSP. But I think a lot of people get tripped up on the biggest thing I see lately has been scoping and the framing of the assessment. So to Brandon's point, And circling back to the data flow, just not understanding the whole business. And there's been a couple times that we've gotten into asking questions and someone has access to CUI that they shouldn't, and we have to stop the assessment because it's clearly don't have their segmentation set up right. So just little
So
things like that.
can you expand on that just a bit? Because I think this is another thing. If, I'm
Yeah,
trying to take this from the business owner standpoint of, oh boy, we're in this, we've invested, and we hit a fork in the road.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
we've got a problem, and there's degrees of this. Can you talk a little bit about like where it's a derailment and where it's an adjustment or
Yeah. So from the assessment standpoint, there's three main phases in the assessment process. Phase one's planning, and this is all based off regulation. So that's kind of open, we kind of confirm scope, triple confirm scope. But then there's phase two, and that's when we'll actually submit the assessment to EMAS and move into the assessment process. So once you're in there, you're kind of locked in. So to your point, if there's a fork in the road, if it is planable, we can work through that. And that
POAM?
may
Will you
be,
just explain that real quick? Because that might be new to
yeah,
some folks. Yeah.
yeah. So programmable control is out of the 110 controls, there's about 48 that are programmable. And basically that means that you can put them on a, a it's a 180-day window basically to correct them. So a good example, one that we see quite a bit actually is encryption on firewalls. It can be programmable if you have encryption in place. However, it's not FIPS validated, right? So that's an example of a programmable one. But that's the fork in the road. So that's what we see. Not a lot, but there are times where they have a non-programmable control, which means that's a control that the Department of War has established as critical. So you
It
must
has to
have
be
that.
met.
It has to be met. So if it's
Okay.
if it's not met, you basically will fail your assessment.
Right.
There's no once we start that timer, so to speak, we can't stop it.
So
So
those are the important. I mean, obviously, you got to go after all these because you only have 180 days to get this more or less corrected anyway. But you really want to make sure that these controls that you must absolutely meet, you're absolutely meeting,
yep,
because that can really derail the process. And then the POAM, which I believe stands for what? Plan of Action and Remediation,
plan of action and milestones. Sorry, I should
and
have said
milestones.
that.
Thank you.
Yep,
Uh,
yep,
that piece gives you a little room, but the other side of this is that if you stack up too many poems, you've got a lot of work to do in a short amount of time in a tight window. So you really want to go into this as prepared as possible. And because you don't want to have to deal with a lot of boomerang effects of this in a short period of time when as much as with the expenses, with contracts waiting, et cetera. So I hope that answers the questions for folks. Um, uh, let's flip into the next phase here, just to make sure we cover some ground. And those of you attending, we would welcome feedback about if we move too fast. If there's more you'd like to learn about these things, please let us know. We're really excited to be able to pull people together and start producing these to give some guidance to a really murky field out there. So our hope is to make this useful for you. So if there are things that we didn't cover enough or that you'd like to see covered, let us know. Let's move into what we're calling the proof and the path forward. Brandon, you've taken people, large complex organizations through this, and we're in the process of moving them through. And they reach certification ahead. Pardon me. We've had some good luck. We've moved some clients through this really effectively. What, in your opinion, sort of got it to where when it got to the audit time or the audit period, what was, if you can name one or two things, what drove success in that more than anything?
I would say, definitely working with the internal teams, and especially leadership. Once you get leadership at the table, I think it makes things a lot easier. Otherwise, again, going back, if you don't have leadership buy-in, it's really a problem because at the end of the day, it comes to appetite for change. If your organization isn't willing to change quickly, you're not going to get through your CMMC process before your certification quick at all. So if you don't have that, I think that's one of the biggest things. So luckily, so far we've had a lot of success, I think, with leadership buy-in and having good points of contact. But if you have people that don't understand CMMC, CUI, or someone at the leadership table to actually help push these, then we run into a lot of issues. And I know, one thing I know I wanted to mention was going back, a couple of years when we had our first client come to us with this, they asked us, can you just flip on the CMMC switch to make us compliant? And
Please.
looking back on that, it's like I don't think there was a lot of guidance around it. And it's funny because a lot of people still to this day think it's that easy of like, oh, for be compliant with CMMC, you just gotta, enable this on the firewall. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. And that's, something we've struggled with a lot. So I think, having someone like Brent using C3POs for guidance, using MSP certified MSPs who know what they're talking about to really help, decipher some of that more complex technical language, especially in the assessment guidelines. It's even me to this day, I still constantly go into C3POs and CCAs to ask, be like, hey, can you give me some clarification on this? Half the time they don't know because the government's just very vague when it comes to actually putting some of that information out there.
I would add to be wary of the inverse of that. You will not make it through this process with providers, be it your MSP or an assessor or any other party that says this is going to be simple. And if they don't say you need to get cultural buy-in, like, oh, we can do this mainly from an IT perspective and a couple procedural changes over here, you're going to waste your time and money. It won't work. You have to go, you really need to go up to the top of the company, frame it, get buy-in, cultural buy-in, and get them behind it. Because this is a little more serious than I think. There is no switch to flip. This is a major endeavor, and it will move your company around in uncomfortable ways at times. So anybody that comes along and says, "Well, we've got this sort of quick enclave, we can put a PC in there, and you do everything on that PC, everything's going to work," there are rare cases when that is the case, but on the whole, you really need to be sober about this and back way up, start at 30,000 feet, get your management team on board, and then start working with serious players that'll move you through it. Brent, I guess I would just check in with you. I think you've
Yeah.
seen the full gamut from a
Yeah.
CMC, but
I think it comes to the word CMMC. It's a maturity model certification. So that maturity model piece is maturing your organization to get to a point to be certified. So that's the
yeah.
goal. And in the 32 CFR, there's a word that's thrown around a few times, which is institutionalization of
Hmm.
of security requirements. So that's basically institutionalizing or embedding a culture of cybersecurity in your organization. And you can't do that when you're siloed. So
Yeah.
that's the whole point of CMMC is to push the DIB in a good direction of creating, a nationwide culture of security.
Yeah, because I think we have to like take a step back, despite where you may sit in your relation to defense and war and weaponry. This is really about protecting our country, and we have to be serious about this work. If you're in this space, you're under siege all the time, and the attacks are coming in, and I think you just have to be serious about being in this or not. But there's no tepid way of doing it. You really have to step into it. Um, so let's talk a little bit about timelines because that's another big thing that catches people early on, especially timelines as we're heading into November of this year and so forth. Brent, what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so right now, a lot of C3POs, they'll probably tell you they're booked out quite a ways, which is true. So most are starting to really fill their calendars. But that's the biggest thing. If you want to get certified in the next, 6 months, that's probably hard if you're not already somewhere down the journey. But I said 9 to 12 months at the beginning, and that's probably fair if you're going to start today or tomorrow on a fresh path. I think that includes working with MSP, finding your gaps, implementing the technology, contracting with a C3PO, and then getting certified. I think 9 to 12 months is probably fair, and I've seen that be replicated over the last 7 years. So
Yeah,
I know it can be done. In terms of C3PO bandwidth, that will be a big concern once enforcement starts happening in contracts, which regulatory bodies, it should be November of this year is the plan with the phased rollout. But a lot of the enforcement now is from primes that
hmm.
we're seeing. But there have been some contracts from the duty with the 7021 clause for the certification. So I
In other
think
words, it's coming early.
it is, and
Yeah.
the ecosystem isn't currently equipped to do 118,000 certifications. There's only been 1,000 done to date. There's 100 C3POs, and if you just do the math on that, that's not it's not equating that well.
Yeah,
So that it is, there's going to be a big demand. Probably more than likely this time next year they'll be pretty booked out. So
it'll be bonkers, right?
yep.
We're seeing the same thing on the MSP side, where there are not many MSPs that are in the space fully, and even those that are sort of doing CSPs and shared responsibility matrices, those are rare as well. So there's just not a lot of bandwidth out there. Um, so real quick, I just want to throw this out, and then we've got some questions that I think we should flip to and address. But if I'm going to ask each of you, like in the next 30 days, if you were thinking about what you would advise clients, people looking at this to do, where would you send them? And I'll start with you, Brent.
Like where would they, to rephrase that, where they send us,
Well,
who would I,
meaning where to start? Like I
yeah,
remember when I was looking at this, it's like, oh goodness, where do I like it's massive, and there are a lot of acronyms. There's a lot of
I,
timing and
Cyber AB. Yeah,
cyber
Cyber
AB.
AB. Yep. The
Okay.
the first thing I do is the cyber accreditation body, go to their website. They'll have all the resources. They
Training,
have it, yep, and the training and everything there. There's a marketplace where you can find the RPOs, which are MSPs and consultants, and then C3POs as well. So I'd say this community is very welcoming. I think everyone that is a C3PO or RPO, they want to get people secure and they want to get, it all comes back to our country, but I think the community is very supportive of that. So I'd start at the Cyber AB's website for sure.
yep. Just step right into it. Brandon, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I think, going more back to, the infrastructure of your environment, I would say things that we've already reiterated a lot is like figure out where the CUI lives. Where is it processed, stored, transmitted? Where do you get it from your contractors? If you have it in your environment at all, is there FCI in your environment as well? Then to go into that, once you get that data flow diagram built out, seeing where it goes and can you do an enclave or does your whole organization need to be in scope? I mean, those before you get into your SSP and all those things, you really need to figure out how you're going to architect and build your environment. Because if you don't know where that CUI lives, realistically, CMMC is going to be really, really hard for you to build out your SSP and work with someone like Brent or other C3POs.
I would add, just from a business owner standpoint, I think you got to look at your potential revenue modeling. You got to look at what your opportunity is here. What do you stand to lose in existing contracts? Um, so what do you stand to gain by keeping them? And then can you expand upon that? And then, of course, the next question is, here's our revenue model. What are we looking at in terms of costs and getting over the finish line of this? And companies like ours are happy to talk to you and give you a sense of just gut sense of where we think you might need to go. And that's a real gut sense. It's a wild ass guess early on, but we can kind of give you some gauging. We like doing those. We like sort of working with clients, trying to help them get a sense of where to go with this, and then quickly move into, simultaneously you're educating yourself, and then you got to make a call because the timing is of essence, and early adopters are showing signs of gaining for having gone early. So let's flip to questions. Emily, do you have some questions that we should try and address here?
Yeah, we actually got a couple. So I think we'll be able to answer them live. We had one coming from Isaac at Mentis, and then we have one coming from Robert. So let's pose Isaac's first. How detailed should you be when describing how you meet AOs in your SSP? Are C3P AOs looking for lots of technical details, or is that better left in evidence screenshots, for example? So I'm gonna hit answer live.
Yeah,
I
I
don't know if
can
that does
take that.
anything. Um,
Yeah, I can take
oh,
that one. Looks like you just moved it to, yeah,
I don't know if you, yeah, okay.
I can take it. Yeah, I
Okay.
think the main thing is it depends is the answer. We as a C3PO and a lot of C3POs will just, if it can support the control, that works for us. So for example, like if it's your incident response control and you're saying how we carry out incident response can be found in incident response policy, then we'll look at that policy. But part of the 32 or part of the 110 controls is the SSP control. And part of that specific control mentions listing out how you're carrying out each security requirement. So the answer there is as long as your SSP isn't basically stating the assessment objective and just saying that's met and not at least describing at a high level where that information can be supported, that won't work. But if you're either sometimes we'll see SSPs that map the assessment objectives, so it'll be A, B, C, D, E, just listed and then mapped to a paragraph. That works. I had one this week where they listed out each of the 320 control objectives, and they just said for each one, that's how they're meeting it. And sometimes it was 3, 4 sentences. It was a 250-page SSP, but for me as an assessor, that worked too. So hopefully that answers it. I think the better answer is it shouldn't just be, yes, we're meeting this and there's no description of where to look, if that makes sense.
So the comprehensiveness does matter in the
Yes.
end. Yeah.
Yep.
Going a little deeper than maybe we think we should, because I guess from my take on this is uh, you don't understand the organization. You've never worked in these companies that you're auditing and assessing. So the more depth you get, the more seriousness you get. Even though it's a lot of documentation, the faster you effectively move through it because it's a little less suspect at what you're looking. You can see what you need to see early on. So I think the comprehensiveness pays off. And that's
Yep.
again, right, going back to those templates and so forth, like you can't just do templates. You have to have the supporting evidence and have it clearly accessible.
And I think a good
Um,
example of that too is like if you start getting into the access control domain, being like authorized users are identified, not just saying authorized users are identified as your answer, but saying authorized users are identified within Active Directory, Office
Yep.
365. I mean, it's literally like just a few more words to say, okay, well, we don't need to know exactly like what OU structure they're in and what your naming scheme is for them, but at least defining where, someone like Brent would ask to look for that information. Like, oh, okay, you say Active Directory. Can you show us an Active Directory export or pull up Active Directory Live? So I think it's that simple as in you don't need to get super
Yep.
technical and detailed, but you at least have to define and not just repeat what the question's actually saying.
Absolutely. That's yep. And I used to see more of the SSPs that just say what the first part, basically users are identified and that's it. And I was like, oh great, well I have nothing to work on. I can't validate this control is met. And then that circles back to a non-pointable control, which is describing your security requirements. So that's an instant. It's a fail on the assessment. You would fail your assessment too. So it circles back to the actual security requirements themselves. So
okay, I think we have time maybe for one or two more questions here. I'm
yeah,
going to throw one,
Yeah.
which I think is an interesting question because, well, it's just for us, it's a really timely question, which is Sandy from Maryland asks, are you seeing clients prefer sort of a fixed price remediation project, or do most engagements stay time and materials due to scope creep and related? And I'm going to start with this question and maybe turn it over to you, Brandon. Again, this ties back to templates. It also ties back to trying to keep these engagements under control. Our goal as an MSP in this space, trying to help our clients through this, is we are working to try and keep these as like more or less fixed engagements. We feel like we can control enough that we can hopefully make it a little safer and a little more offer a little more assurance to clients that if we work closely together, we get the cultural buy-in and so forth, that we can move clients through this in an orderly enough way that we'll take on some of the risk because we've got all these tools and experience to move clients through this. Our whole MSP fundamentally is based on not doing time and materials, but doing it all within the engagement because we feel like that keeps us with skin in the game, and we're trying to do that in the CMMC space. So yes, that's a little plug, but I actually think it's possible to do this, and I think it's actually a way of sharing risk going through it, which is important when you're engaging with a provider. Um, Brandon, you've probably been subject to more of this and how this plays out in the real world, but what do you think?
Yeah, I've been involved in a lot of the pricing stuff and seen what a lot of, other MSPs are doing out there. And I personally really like the approach of including, everything all in one as a per user per month cost. Because then you're not, nickeling, diming or, time materialing, like some other MSPs do out there where it's like, okay, you don't necessarily know what you're getting into. It's like, okay, well now you're $200,000 in time and material to build out your SSP. So I think building the rapport with the client by saying, hey, we're helping you with all this and you know exactly what it's going to cost, helps helps them sleep at night and helps us sleep at night because they don't have to wake up next day to, a couple $100,000 bill they weren't expecting. So I like just having everything up front and, visible to, people when we're doing it. I know there's a lot of people out there that don't do it that way. And I've heard from, other organizations that they end up getting random bills they weren't expecting because they just didn't know how much time it actually took to get through CMMC. And just by having it all inclusive, I think it makes it a lot easier to justify and, go back to your leadership team and be like, hey, this is exactly what it's going to cost. There's always going to be some projects in there you can't account for that's, going to take up time no matter where you go. But I think making it as inclusive as you can is really beneficial.
Uh, Brent, I would do you gosh, I don't want this to sound like a leading question, but I would imagine in your world you see some pretty weary people coming into the audit phase, right? They've been beat up, it's gone all over the map, they've struggled along the way, or maybe not. Well, have you seen that on your side when they come in sort of road weary?
Yeah, I think so. I think we try to set him at ease, but
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think it just we added a pre-planning phase, which kind of I think helps set the tone and re course directs, if you will, and they know our definitive path to get to the assessment, and we answer any questions that they want us to answer, and we're happy to do that. And I think that helps. But
That
I think
relates
it,
to a question around mock assessments. Does that tie
yeah,
to, is that kind of what you're getting at?
yeah. Emily, do you want to read that one? I know we're almost to time here, but we could probably.
Yeah, we have I want to make sure we get to this one and then we have one more from Robert as well that I want to make sure that we get
Okay.
addressed.
Okay.
So this one from Lawrence says, how do you coordinate handoff between MSP remediation work and the C3PAO assessment prep? Do you perform mock assessments or does the C3PAO come in cold?
Yeah. So I'll this is probably an open approach question too, but I think from what I see, we do a mock assessment as well. I think that actually it goes pretty smooth. So if I was working with anyone, I do suggest having a C3PO that you're working with do the mock. We can't provide any consulting advice, but we simply can say a control's met or not met, and we'll give a high level description of, could not validate due to not being able to see this, basically. So we're not telling you how to implement, how to change your environment. We're just telling you we couldn't validate it because we didn't see this. Um, and that goes a long ways. But we usually will try to coordinate that with you. So if you have a mock that you're having with your MSP, we'll maybe have, if you're open to it, we'll have someone maybe on the call, see how it goes. But it all kind of drives efficiencies to the assessment. So that usually leads to the assessment usually taking only 2 to 3 days, because we know your environment going into it. Sorry, that's a long-winded question answer, but
And
No, I think that's it though.
And I'll
Brandon?
I'll pitch into it a little bit too here is I've personally seen a lot of values in the mock. We didn't actually do a mock for ourselves initially because we felt really confident in it. But when you get into those more complex environments where, even with, a certified MSP like us, stuff will always get missed or sort of in the cracks. And just being able to have someone else, like a couple CCAs, grilling you on questions and you're like, oh, I didn't think about that. I think it really is eye-opening and it allows you that chance to, fix something before you have your actual assessment.
Without the
Um,
pressure.
so I've always taken the stance of, I think, clients should definitely do it. And it does really speed up the main assessment because the auditors already know the environment. They're not going to be really surprised by anything. And you already have an understanding of how your assessment is going to go and what the auditor is going to be like. Because generally, I mean, if you're partnering with the same C3PO for the mock and the actual assessment, it's going to be the same auditors. I mean, that might differ between C3POs, but really does add a lot of efficiencies, I think.
So we've got a bunch of questions we're not going to get to, which is great because we could build this into material for future meetings and webinars. But
I
Emily, you said you have
We
one more
we have
question. We're
one
right
more
at time.
question. Yep.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
this one's from Robert Hank. How does an MSP address VDI in terms of function and scope minimization?
Yeah, so I can handle that. It's definitely really depends on your environment and what you're trying to do. If you're trying to break out, your core company and almost build an enclave, then it might require restructuring in a new VDI environment. But if it's, removing things like printer redirection, copying and pasting, and things along those lines, it might be an inconvenience to your normal company, but be a need for your, enclave company or your compliance side of the company. So it would really boil down to what you're looking to do and what the CUI is actually flowing in your environment. I think it's definitely doable, but you do have to be careful if you start doing a VDI where you're almost using split interface of, normal users using it, but also your CUI users, because there's the potential for flow between the two that you don't necessarily want. So a little bit of a vague answer to the question, but it's hard to fully answer that without knowing more about the scope. Brent, I don't know if you have any additional information on that, but
No,
I
I think
do
that's
want to say
fair.
it's not a panacea. It doesn't fix every problem. Like the idea,
Yeah.
okay, we isolate it in a VDI and that's where it all takes place. Everything's going to be fine. The fact is that often doesn't cut it.
but it
Yeah, it just
does, yeah.
depends on the business case. I think that's what comes down to, honestly.
It
Yeah,
does
yeah.
help things a lot. I mean, we use VDI internally, and it helps greatly reduce your scope. But again, it comes back to, what's your infrastructure look like? Are you have physical assets? So that's a very big question that, is you need time to dive into and actually see how it's working in your environment.
Okay, we're over time, and so we'll wrap it up here. I just want to thank Brent. Thank you for joining us. It was great having you
Thank
here,
you.
Brandon. Thank you for your insights on this. Those of you that attended, thank you very much. It's great to have you here. We are here to as a resource. We want to, I think Brent alluded to the fact that the community itself is really a supportive community, and not everybody's out there just trying to get your contract, but people are here to try and support you and guide you and get you to the right resources. That includes us, that includes like Bailey, and the rest of the community. So if you have other questions or other things that we didn't get to today, please send them in. Emily tracks this. We'll build another webinar. We really do want to be of assistance to you all as you're looking at this because there is a tidal wave coming, and we want to see people get through it. So thanks to everybody for joining us today, panelists. Thank you. And Emily, thanks for getting this done and pulling it all together. Hope you guys have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Thanks.
All right.
all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.